Hi, folks, and welcome back to the original church. Did the original church have the Mass? Well, first of all, let's not get too hung up on English words. The word Mass is just the English translation of a Latin word that was the Western name for this thing that we've called the Lord's Supper after the Last Supper, or communion, or that now we're calling the Eucharist. And remember, the word Eucharist is just the Greek word for thanksgiving. And the original Christians did call it the Thanksgiving, the Eucharist. Now, when we say the Mass, we might be referring to the whole worship service, or we might be referring to just the Eucharist itself. But basically, there are two parts to the liturgy. There is the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. The liturgy of the Word has a lot of scripture readings, but it all leads up to the Eucharist itself. Now, it was actually the Protestant Reformation that made preaching the center of worship. And if you go into an old school Protestant church, look straight up the center aisle, and what will you see front and center but the pulpit? The pulpit is front and center. But in the Catholic world and in the Orthodox world, what is front and center is the table of the Eucharist, which is actually an altar. And so it was really the Protestant Reformation that made preaching the center of worship, in part to convince people that they had made the right move from Catholicism to a more reformed movement. But Paul actually says that the primary proclamation of the gospel is the Eucharist itself. Early Eucharistic liturgy was actually based more on John chapter 6, where Jesus says, "My flesh is true food and my blood is true drink," than on the Last Supper stuff from the Gospels and from 1 Corinthians 11. That stuff was all added later, after Christianity was legalized and so many people were joining the church who didn't really understand the Eucharist or where it came from. And so they actually added that stuff later to help teach people what the Eucharist was all about. It's all great, it's all relevant, it's good that it's in there, but it was added later. Originally, it was all about John chapter 6. Now you might be thinking, what does the New Testament tell us about what early worship was like? The truth is, it really doesn't tell us much. There is nothing in the New Testament to give us any indication about what we might call an order of worship, or the form or format of the structure of worship. Now you can look at places like Acts 20 or 1 Corinthians 11 through 14 that give us some hints, and I'll talk about these in a minute, but there's really no structure there. There's nothing we can point to that gives us any idea what early worship was like. Some have also suggested that early Christian worship was based on the structure of Greco-Roman banquets. But there's no way the early Christians would have based their liturgy on pagan banquets. And in fact, this is exactly what the Apostle Paul was criticizing in 1 Corinthians 11. He was criticizing rich Christians who were treating the agape meal like it was a pagan banquet. Now, in fact, early Christian liturgy, and the Eucharist specifically, is based on the Jewish ritual meals, like the Sabbath meal. And in fact, when Jesus instituted the Mass at the Lord's Supper, what he was doing was taking a Jewish Sabbath meal and Passover meal and adapting it to institute what we might call the Lord's Supper, communion, or the Eucharist. Now, there was some tolerance for some freedom within the structure of the early liturgy. And we can see this in, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 14. We can see it in Tertullian. But there was no tolerance for disorder or chaos. And this is why Paul himself says there's no room for all of this speaking in tongues without interpretation. And so while there was some tolerance for a diversity of practice, and even for some ad-libbing in terms of the prayers on the part of the presider, there was no tolerance for chaos or disorder. So, the Eucharist was based on the Jewish table rituals, and we know that at the beginning it was done in the context of a meal, just like the Last Supper. We call this the agape meal. But very quickly, it goes from a sacrament in the midst of a meal to a morning liturgy separate from the meal. It's very interesting. If you look at Acts chapter 20, it says there that Paul celebrated the Eucharist after midnight, but before dawn. And then if you look at 1 Corinthians 11, there it's suggested that the meal was between the bread and the cup. So the bread was consecrated and shared at the beginning, then they had the meal, and then the cup after the meal. But if you look at the Didache, which is our first sort of church order manual that comes from later in the first century, there it has the opposite order. So we know that there was as yet no standard format for an order of liturgy. And I think it was partly because of the problems that St. Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 11 and some other issues that I'll mention in a second, that the church was kind of forced to switch from an evening meal to a morning liturgy where the Eucharist is separate from the meal itself. Now, we have a very important letter from a pagan Roman governor named Pliny. He wrote to the Emperor Trajan. This is at the beginning of the 2nd century. And he wrote to describe what was going on with the Christians in his region. And there in that letter, he tells the emperor that the Christians were meeting before daybreak to sing hymns to Christ and to share a sacramentum. Now, of course, we can't assume that he was using the word sacrament the way we would use it, because he's not a Christian, obviously, and so he might have been referring to the Eucharist, he might have been referring to prayers, he might have been referring to the creed, because a sacramentum in the Roman mind is a kind of a vow. But it's very interesting that he tells us that the Christians were meeting before daybreak, specifically because he had forbidden them to meet in the evening based on one of Trajan's laws. Trajan had a law against the meeting of secret societies, and Pliny was interpreting that law to say that Christians could not have their evening Eucharist. And so the Christians in his area, at least, were forced to move the Eucharist from the evening meal to the morning. They might have still gotten away with an evening meal, but no Eucharist in the evening. Now the Eucharist is in the morning. About 40 years later, we have the Apology of Justin Martyr, which is the first kind of order of worship that we get from the original church. Now, Justin doesn't specifically say that he's describing a morning liturgy, but we assume that he is because this is now 40 years after Pliny's letter. And what we get in Justin is now a kind of standardized order of worship or liturgy that is surprisingly almost exactly like the Mass of today. But is the Mass a sacrifice? Well, it turns out that it is called a sacrifice in the earliest documents. They refer to the Mass as the Church's sacrifice or the sacrifice of the Church. But that was never meant to contradict Hebrews 10, where it says that, of course, the death of Christ was a once and for all sacrifice. Jesus does not need to die again, that's obvious. But in the Mass, the Passion of Christ is represented, very much like the way the Passover represented the Exodus. And the way I was taught, and I love this phrase, is that it is past history made present mystery. And remember that Paul said that this is the primary presentation of the gospel. So in representing the Passion of Christ in the Mass, we are presenting the gospel. And so the sacrifice of Christ is not done over, but it is represented or even reenacted. And in that sense, the Mass is a sacrifice. But it's called an unbloody sacrifice, to make that clear. It's also a sacrifice that we make for thanksgiving, to bring something to God in gratitude. And this is the sacrifice of praise that's mentioned a little bit later in Hebrews in chapter 13. And so it's kind of a middle way, right, between the old sacrifices that have to be repeated, but on the other hand, We don't go to the other extreme and say, no ritual, no sacrifice at all. We don't repeat the animal sacrifices, but we don't go to the other extreme and say that it's only a memorial. It is more than just a remembering. Yes, Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. But remember this, a sacrament is primarily something that God does, not something that we do. And so if it were just a memorial, it would only be something that we do. No, a sacrament is primarily something that God does, and it's a mystery. And the original Christians referred to the Eucharist as the mystery of the Church. So yes, our role includes remembering, but it's more than that. God is active in the sacrament, bringing forgiveness and grace. It's not re-crucifying Christ, but it is a representation of the passion of Christ that makes it effective for the individual believer, for the recipient of grace. Always remember, John chapter 6, Jesus said, "My flesh is true food and my blood is true drink." And remember John chapters 14 and 15, where Jesus says, "I am the vine and you are the branches. Remain in me and I will remain in you." How is it that the original Christians saw themselves as remaining in Jesus, Jesus remaining in them, remaining connected to Jesus in this way? They saw that as happening through the regular reception of the Eucharist. I know I've quoted this before, but it's worth repeating. Hebrews 4:16. So, let us confidently approach the throne of grace to receive mercy and to find grace for timely help. The throne of grace is the Eucharist, and that's how it was in the original church. Thanks for joining me. Hey, thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. I really appreciate that. Please share this video with your friends, and please join me in the original church community on locals.com. Don't forget that if you join the original church community on locals.com, you can join me each week for a live, in-depth, chronological Bible study. It's live streamed every Saturday, but you can watch it later if you're not available. So join me for that, and I'll see you there. I hope to see you there. I hope to see you there, and I'll see you there.